My name is Renee Voss. I'm 36. I investigate fraud for a living, which is either a very funny detail or a very sad one, depending on how you look at what happened to me. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, a woman named Angela called my desk phone at work, and the first sentence out of her mouth changed the next 4 months of my life. Hi, is this Renee Voss? I'm calling from Heritage Union Bank regarding your home equity loan, account ending 4471. We show a payment 61 days past due. I remember laughing, actually laughing, and telling her she had the wrong Renee Voss because I didn't have a loan with Heritage Union Bank. I'd never even opened an account there. She was very polite. She asked me to confirm my date of birth and the last four of my social security number, just to be sure we were talking about the same file. I gave them to her the way you give your own name without thinking twice. There was a pause on her end, the kind of pause that tells you someone is looking at a screen and deciding how to say the next part gently. Ma'am, she said, you're listed as a co-borrower on this loan. It was opened 14 months ago. The primary borrower's obligation was recently discharged in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. That makes you the responsible party on the account now. I sat very still at my desk. 14 months ago, I had been at my own kitchen table, paying my own mortgage on time, the way I always did, the way I'd built my entire adult life to do. I asked her whose name was listed as the primary borrower. She read it to me the way you'd read a grocery list, like it was nothing. Gerald Voss. My father. And that's how I found out my parents had put my name on a bankruptcy filing I never signed, for a loan I never took out, and left me to find out about it from a stranger reading numbers off a screen. Welcome back to the quiet ledger, where the people who always paid the bill finally get to read the invoice out loud. I'm Renee, and if you've ever been the reliable one in your family, the one with the good credit and the steady job and the calm voice they call when something's on fire, stay with me, because this story is for you. Drop a comment and subscribe, because what happened in that kitchen 4 months later is going to make you glad you did. To understand why it took a stranger on the phone to tell me about my own name on a federal document, you have to understand who I was in my family, because it explains everything else. I'm a senior claims examiner for a regional insurance company. For 11 years, my job has been reading documents other people hoped nobody would read closely. I look at accident reports, medical bills, repair estimates, and I find the places where the story doesn't match the paperwork. I'm good at it. I've testified in 3 civil cases about signature inconsistencies and altered dates. I know what a forged document looks like before I know why it matters. I say that not to brag, but because it makes what happened to me almost unbearable in its irony. I read fraud for a living, and the fraud that finally caught me came from the people who taught me what family was supposed to mean. I grew up the older of two. My brother Brett is 5 years younger, and from the time he could talk, he was the exciting one. He wanted to be a chef, then a musician, then he wanted to open a restaurant, and every version of that dream got a parade. I wanted to be an actuary in the 7th grade, and my mother, Diane, told a room full of her book club that I was the practical one, the way you describe a good pair of walking shoes. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was just the weather in our house, and I'd stopped expecting it to change. Brett got the parade. I got the compliment that sounded like a demotion. My father, Gerald, has run Voss Auto Sales on Route 9 for 31 years. A used car lot with his name on the sign in letters he repainted himself every few summers. He's proud in the quiet way men from small towns are proud, which means he'd rather lose a limb than ask for help out loud. My mother volunteers for 2 church committees and the Historical Society Board, and she keeps score of everyone's contributions to the family the way other people keep score of a card game. Except she's the only one who ever sees the scoreboard. I paid my own way through college on scholarships and night shifts at a call center. When I graduated, I bought a used sedan with cash I'd saved, and my mother told the extended family I was so independent. which in our family's dialect meant nobody needed to help me. So nobody did. When Brett dropped out of culinary school 2 credits short, my parents paid off his loan balance so it wouldn't follow him. When he needed $40,000 2 years ago to open a restaurant called The Junction, they found it. I never asked where from. I told myself it wasn't my business, and some part of me, the part that had learned not to expect a parade, believed that. I met my husband, Marcus, 9 years ago. He's a CPA, methodical in the way accountants are supposed to be and rarely are. And the first time he came to a Voss family dinner, he watched my mother ask Brett 3 questions about his menu and ask me 1 question about whether my health insurance had a good copay. And afterward, in the car, he said, very carefully, your family talks to you like your utility company. I laughed because it was funny and because it was true, and I didn't think about it again for years. I should have. I don't say any of this for sympathy. I say it because 3 years before that phone call, something happened that would let my family use my own name against me. And I need you to understand the version of me who let it happen, because she was doing what she always did. She was being useful. She had no idea useful had an expiration date, and that someone in her own family was going to use it after it expired. 3 years before the phone call, my father had a heart attack in the middle of a Tuesday, closing out the register at the dealership. He survived it, but barely. And the 6 weeks after were a blur of hospital hallways and insurance calls and a rehab facility that smelled like bleach and vending machine coffee. My mother came apart at every appointment, the kind of coming apart that meant someone else had to hold the clipboard, and that someone was me. I took 2 weeks of unpaid leave. I sat with a lawyer named Thomas Rayburn, the same man who handled the dealership's paperwork, and at my mother's asking, I signed a durable general power of attorney so I could manage my father's affairs while he couldn't. I paid the dealership's insurance premium so the doors could stay open. I filled out short-term disability forms. I gave the hospital my own phone number as the emergency contact because my mother kept missing calls. Somewhere in those 6 weeks, I handed my mother a folder with copies of everything the lawyer's office needed from me: my driver's license, my social security card, a specimen signature page the notary used to certify the power of attorney itself. My father recovered enough to go back to the lot part-time. The crisis ended the way crises do in families like mine, quietly, without anyone officially closing the file. Nobody ever told me to destroy that folder. Nobody ever asked me to revoke the power of attorney once he didn't need it. And I didn't think to ask either, because who thinks about paperwork like that once the emergency is over? I moved apartments twice in the years after. I got engaged to Marcus. I let that folder, and everything in it, fade into the part of my memory reserved for things that were finished. It wasn't finished. It was sitting in a drawer in my parents' house on Larkspur Lane the whole time, a folder with my signature, my social security number, and my date of birth, filed under a label in my mother's handwriting that just said, Renee, Dad's stuff. 3 years later, when Voss Auto sales started drowning for the second time and Brett's restaurant started drowning for the first, someone in that house remembered exactly what was in that drawer. I want to be honest that I had pieces of this before the phone call. I just didn't assemble them, because I'd spent my whole life trained not to ask questions that might make a family dinner uncomfortable. That winter, the Junction had a rough patch. A main supplier cut Brett off over an unpaid invoice. And for 2 weeks, the specials board out front just said, ask your server, which everyone in town understood meant the kitchen didn't have enough to promise anything. Then, in early spring, the Junction reopened with a new patio, new signage, and a full menu. And Brett posted a photo online with a caption about family who believes in you. I remember looking at that photo and feeling the old familiar thing, not quite jealousy, more like standing outside a window watching a party you weren't invited to plan. Around the same time, my mother started calling more, the way she does when she wants something but hasn't decided how to ask for it yet. She asked, almost in passing, whether Marcus and I still had good credit, whether we'd ever consider co-signing anything. Family helps family. You know how your father is about asking. I told her we weren't in a position to take on anyone else's debt, which was true, and she said, of course. Of course. In the exact tone I'd later learn meant she'd already stopped listening. I also noticed, and dismissed, a single piece of mail. A postcard from Heritage Union Bank addressed to me, but at an old apartment on Winslow Street I hadn't lived at in 3 years. Forwarded to me by the current tenant, a stranger kind enough to drop it in a new envelope with a sticky note that said, I think this is yours? It was a generic loan servicing update, the kind of thing banks mail without much detail. A slip of paper thanking me for my business. I remember standing in my kitchen holding it, thinking it had to be a mailing list error, and I threw it away. Hold on to that address, Winslow Street, because it comes back later. And it's the reason a federal court notice that should have reached me instead sat in a stranger's mailbox for months. But that spring, all I had was a strange postcard and a bad feeling I didn't trust myself to act on. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at my desk, and a woman named Angela introduced herself. And the bad feeling finally had a name. I didn't cry at my desk. I want to tell you that clearly because it matters for what came next. I've sat with claim files describing far worse mornings than mine, and I've learned that the moment right after a shock is not the moment for feeling. It's the moment for the next right action. I asked Angela to confirm the loan number, the date it was opened, and the amount, and I wrote every word down on a legal pad the way I would for a case file. I told her I needed to verify her identity before discussing anything further, hung up, and called Heritage Union Bank's main line myself, the number printed on their actual website, not the one she called from. A different representative confirmed everything Angela had told me. A home equity secured personal loan, opened 14 months earlier, original principal $152,000, secured against a property on Larkspur Lane. Primary borrower, Gerald Voss. Co-borrower, Renee Voss. I asked for copies of the signed loan agreement to be mailed and emailed to me. Then I did the thing my job has trained into my spine. I pulled my credit reports from all three bureaus that same afternoon on my lunch break. In the parking lot of my own office, hands steadier than I expected. There it was, on all three. A trade line from Heritage Union Bank, opened 14 months ago. Current balance 144,000. 61 days delinquent. Reported jointly under my name and my father's. I did four things before I went back inside for my 2 o'clock meeting. I placed a fraud alert on all three credit files. I requested a full account statement history on the loan. I wrote down every date, every name, every number Angela had given me. The way I chart a claim, because a memory is an opinion and a written record is a fact. And I called Marcus. He came to pick me up instead of letting me drive myself home, which tells you something about the state I was actually in underneath the calm. In the car, I said the only thing that made any sense to me. They used the folder, I said. He didn't ask which folder. He'd heard the story of the power of attorney enough times over the years to understand instantly. The one from your dad's heart attack, he said. And I nodded, and neither of us said anything else for a long time, because there wasn't anything gentle left to say. That night, I didn't sleep, and I didn't call my mother either, though every instinct in me wanted to. I've learned, from claims work and from a lifetime in that family, that the first phone call after a discovery is the one that tips your hand. I wanted to know what I was actually looking at before I let anyone know I was looking. So I waited one more day, and I called someone whose job it was to know exactly what I was looking at. Paul O'Kafer had represented a coworker of mine 2 years earlier in an identity theft case involving a stolen tax refund, and she'd told me then, only half joking, that if anything like this ever happened to me, he was the man to call. I called him on a Thursday morning and was sitting across from his desk by Friday afternoon. the loan documents, and my credit reports in a plain manila folder in my lap, though I didn't notice the symmetry of that folder until much later. Paul read everything twice before he said a word, which I respected. Then he leaned back and started walking me through it the way you'd walk someone through a diagnosis. The power of attorney you signed 3 years ago, he said, gave your father the authority to act on his own behalf using documents you helped prepare. It did not give anyone authority to sign your name as a co-borrower on a new debt for someone else's benefit. That's not power of attorney misuse. That's forgery. Possibly notary fraud too, if whoever notarized this didn't actually witness you sign it, which I'm guessing they didn't, since you weren't there. I asked him what happened next. He explained it in plain terms. Under federal law, a bank that discovers a signature was forged as part of identity theft is required to investigate. And if the claim holds up, remove the fraudulent debt from the victim's credit and liability. But the bank wouldn't do that on my word alone. I'd need a police report. I'd need a notarized identity theft affidavit, filed through the Federal Trade Commission's identity theft reporting system. I'd need a signature comparison, which, given my job, I could help build myself, alongside a document examiner if it ever came to a dispute. Then he told me the part that actually took my breath away. There's something else, he said. You mentioned your parents recently filed bankruptcy. If you're a co-borrower on a debt, federal bankruptcy law requires them to list you as a co-debtor on their schedules. It's called Schedule H. It's not optional. If their attorney did his job honestly, your name is sitting in a federal court filing right now, whether you ever knew about it or not. I sat very still. You're telling me, I said, that somewhere there's an actual document filed with a federal court with my name on it, and I've never seen it. I'm telling you it's public record, Paul said, which means we can pull it this afternoon. We did. And that's when the story stopped being about one phone call and started being about how far back the paper trail really went. Paul's paralegal pulled the bankruptcy docket that same afternoon while I sat in his office lobby, drinking bad coffee out of a paper cup, doing the thing I do at work when a claim file is thin and I need to hold still until it isn't. The case was real. Voss, Gerald, and Diane, Chapter 7, filed 4 months earlier in the same county where I'd grown up. Attorney of record, Thomas Rayburn, the same lawyer who'd handled my father's business for decades. The same man who'd notarized my power of attorney 3 years before. Schedule H, your co-debtors, was 2 pages in. My name was there, Renee Voss. And beneath it, an address I hadn't lived at in 3 years. 214 Winslow Street, Apartment 3. The old apartment. The postcard address. I sat in that lobby chair and understood, all at once, why a court notice that federal law required to be mailed to me as a listed co-debtor had never once reached me. It hadn't been lost. It had been sent exactly where my parents' own outdated paperwork said I lived, to an apartment I'd left the year Marcus, and I got engaged. And nobody in that house had ever bothered to ask me for a current address, because asking would have meant admitting there was something coming that I needed to know about. Paul pointed out something else on the same page, something I'd have missed if fraud examination weren't my actual job. The co-debtor listing described the debt only as Home Equity Loan, Heritage Union Bank, with no note, no explanation, nothing that acknowledged I hadn't known about it. Legally, that was accurate. Emotionally, it was the coldest sentence I have ever read about myself. 4 words on a federal form, filed by my own parents, that treated the fact of my involvement as a settled, unremarkable detail instead of the thing that would end up rearranging my entire understanding of my family. Then Paul turned to the Statement of Financial Affairs, the part of a bankruptcy petition where a debtor has to disclose, under penalty of perjury, any payments or transfers made to family members in the year before filing. It's there specifically so a trustee can catch someone hiding money from creditors by quietly handing it to a relative before declaring themselves broke. I watched Paul's finger run down the page, and I watched it stop. There was one transfer listed, $11,000, to my mother's sister, described as repayment of a personal loan. Nothing about Brett. Nothing about the junction. Nothing about $87,000. You said the restaurant reopened right around the time this loan funded, Paul said. 19 days, I said, because I'd already checked. The loan funded on a Tuesday in January. Brett's restaurant reopened on a Sunday in February, 19 days later. We couldn't prove the connection yet with anything but a calendar, and a calendar isn't evidence. It's a suspicion with good posture. So Paul sent a formal records request to Heritage Union Bank for the loan disbursement history, which, as a legally interested party disputing the debt, I was entitled to receive. 2 weeks later, it arrived. The full $152,000 had been disbursed to a Voss Auto Sales business account, and 9 days after that, a transfer of $87,000 had moved out of that account into an account belonging to an LLC called The Junction, dated exactly 10 days before the restaurant's grand reopening. There was one more document I wanted, and it was the smallest one, and it turned out to matter the most. Most states require notaries to keep a journal, a physical logbook recording every document they notarize, the date, the signer's name, and usually a form of ID they checked. Phyllis Dunmore, a family friend from our church who worked part-time at a shipping store on Route 9, had notarized the loan's co-borrower signature page. Under my state's public records provisions, I was entitled to request the specific journal entry tied to my name. The entry didn't exist. There was a page for that date. There were 4 other notarizations logged on it, initialed, dated, ID types noted. Where mine should have been, between a car title transfer at 9:40 in the morning and a power of attorney at 11:15, there was nothing. No line. No entry. Which meant, as Paul put it plainly, that as far as the official record was concerned, I had never walked through that door at all, because I hadn't. I sat with that for a long time, not the anger yet, just the strange, quiet fact of it. My signature existed on a bank document. My name existed on a federal filing. And in the one place where the law actually required someone to look me in the eye and check my ID before putting my name on anything, there was nothing but a gap in a logbook, exactly the shape of a person who was never there. If you've ever found your own name in a place you never agreed to be, type "I'm here" in the comments, and stay with me, because I hadn't confronted anyone yet. I called my mother on a Sunday evening, a week after the notary journal came back empty. I didn't tell her what I had. I wanted to hear what she'd say with nothing in front of her but her own conscience. "Mom," I said, "I need to ask you about a loan with Heritage Union Bank." There was a pause, the kind with a door behind it. Then my mother's voice came back bright, too bright. The voice she used for the garden club. "Oh, honey, is this about the equity loan? I've been meaning to explain that to you." "Meaning to," I repeated. "Your father was in a terrible spot with the dealership," she said, the words picking up speed the way they always did when she was building a case instead of having a conversation. "The bank wanted a stronger application. You have such good credit, Renee. You always have, and we still had your information from when you helped us before, and it just made sense to include you. We were always going to tell you. We just wanted to get through the worst of it first." "You forged my signature," I said. "You had someone falsely notarize it. My name is on a bankruptcy filing I've never seen." "It's not forgery," she said, and I could hear her reaching for the word like it might burn her. "It's family helping family. You had the power of attorney. We used what we already had. Nobody was trying to hurt you. We just needed it to work, and you would have said yes anyway. You always say yes. So what's the difference?" I sat with that sentence for a moment, because it was, in its own way, the most honest thing she'd said. You always say yes. So what's the difference? The difference, I told her, was that yes is supposed to be mine to give. Where did the money go, Mom? I asked, already knowing. There was the pause again. Some of it helped your brother get back on his feet, she said. The restaurant was going to close. Renee, you don't understand what that would have done to him. And the bankruptcy, I said. What happened to the loan when Dad filed? The lawyer said it had to be listed, she said. And for the first time her voice had a crack in it, not guilt exactly. More like frustration that the paperwork hadn't cooperated with the plan. He said it was the law. I told him it wasn't fair to you, that we'd sort it out privately. But he said if we didn't list it, it was fraud on the court, and your father wouldn't risk that. Notice what she was actually telling me, because I noticed it later, replaying the call. My mother hadn't objected to using my name without asking. She'd objected to the paperwork, honestly reflecting that she'd done it. She would have kept it hidden from me forever if a lawyer hadn't forced her hand on a technicality. And even then, her complaint wasn't about me. It was about fairness to herself, dressed up in my name. I'm not signing anything or paying anything until my lawyer looks at all of it, I told her. A lawyer, she repeated, like I'd said something obscene. Renee, we're your parents. I know, I said. That's what makes this so hard to say out loud. And I ended the call, because arguing with my mother had never once in my life changed her mind, and I wasn't going to waste the last of my patience finding that out again. I spent a lot of nights that spring trying to understand my mother, not to forgive her, but because I've learned in claims work that you can't properly assess a story until you understand what the person telling it was actually protecting. My mother grew up the younger daughter of a man who lost his own hardware business in a bad year when she was 12. And she's told that story the same way every time I've heard it, not as a tragedy, but as a warning. She watched her father go from being greeted by name at the diner to being quietly uninvited from things. And she decided, somewhere in that childhood, that a family standing was the one asset you never let a bad year take from you, even if it meant not looking too closely at how you kept it. I think, in her mind, using my name wasn't a betrayal at all. It was a resource. The same way the house was a resource. The same way Brett's charm at church functions was a resource. She'd spent my whole life treating my competence as something the family owned collectively, the way you treat a tool in a shed. Useful precisely because it never asked what it was being used for. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She genuinely couldn't see a difference between using my credit and using a crowbar. And that's what made her so hard to argue with, and so much easier, eventually, to stop trying to. Understanding her didn't fix anything. It just meant that when I finally stood in that kitchen with a folder full of paperwork, I wasn't surprised by anything she said. I already knew, before she opened her mouth, that her first instinct would be to protect the story instead of the daughter, because that's what she'd been protecting her entire life, long before I was ever born into the job of being useful to it. 2 weeks later, my mother called again, warmer this time, careful. She wanted a family dinner, this Sunday, at the house on Larkspur Lane. Just family, she said, and then, almost as an afterthought, and Aunt Ellen's going to be in town, and Jody's coming by after her shift, so it'll be nice to have everyone together. I understood the move immediately, because I'd read enough claim files built on pressure instead of facts to recognize the shape of one. She wanted witnesses. Not witnesses to the truth, witnesses to me. She wanted a room full of relatives who loved a peaceful Sunday more than they loved an uncomfortable one. A room where the weight of everyone's collective discomfort would land on whoever refused to let the discomfort end. And that was never going to be her. I told Paul about the invitation. He didn't tell me not to go. He told me something more useful. If you go, he said, go with the facts, not with your feelings. Feelings are the one thing they know exactly how to use against you. Facts, they don't have an answer for. So I spent that Saturday the way I spend the night before I present a complicated claim to a review board. I made clean copies of everything. The loan agreement with the notarization page, the credit report showing the trade line, the Schedule H page with my name and the old Winslow Street address. The bank's disbursement history showing the $87,000 leaving the dealership account and landing at the junction 19 days before it reopened. The blank line in the notary's journal where my name should have been. I put it all in a plain folder, and I didn't write a single word of my own on any of it, because I'd learned by then that the documents didn't need my help to say what they said. Marcus offered to come. I told him I needed to walk into that house alone, the way I'd walked into every emergency in that family alone for years. Except this time, I wasn't walking in to fix something for them. I was walking in to make them look at what they'd already broken. If you're still with me, stay close, because Sunday dinner was about to become the most important meal of my adult life. Hit subscribe so you don't miss how that folder finally got opened at the table. The house on Larkspur Lane smelled like it always did on a Sunday. Roast chicken and my mother's rosemary potatoes. A smell I'd associated with safety my whole childhood and would never fully trust the same way again after that afternoon. My father was in his recliner when I walked in, thinner than he'd been at Christmas, and he didn't quite meet my eyes, which told me more than anything he could have said. My mother was at the stove in her good apron, the one she wore for company. Aunt Ellen was setting the table. Jody waved from the couch. Brett was leaning against the kitchen counter with a beer. And when he saw the folder under my arm, something in his face went very still. The way a man's face goes still when he already suspects the weather is about to change. We sat down to eat, and for 20 minutes, it was almost normal, almost the life I used to have. And I let it be normal, because I'd learned that timing was the one thing I actually controlled in that house. When my mother started clearing the plates for dessert, I set the folder on the table instead of my dish. Before dessert, I said, I want to talk about the loan. My mother's hand stilled over the plates. Renee, we have company, she said, glancing at Aunt Ellen the way you glance at a fire alarm you were hoping wouldn't go off. I know, I said. I think that's actually the right amount of people to hear this. I opened the folder and set the loan agreement on the table. The notarization page turned up. 14 months ago, I said, someone signed my name as a co-borrower on a $152,000 loan against this house. I never signed it. I was never in the room where it was signed. I slid the notary's journal page next to it. This is the notary's own logbook. There's an entry for a car title at 9:40 that morning and a power of attorney at 11:15. There's nothing for me in between, because I was at work that day. I can prove that too. If anyone wants my time card. Nobody asked for the time card. My father was looking at his hands. Aunt Ellen had gone very quiet, her fork frozen halfway to her plate. Renee, please, my mother said, and her voice shifted into the wounded register I recognized from a lifetime of watching her use it on other people. You're going to make this into something ugly in front of your aunt. It was already ugly, I said. I just brought the paperwork. I set down the Schedule H page next. This is from your bankruptcy filing. My name is listed here as a co-debtor at an apartment I moved out of 3 years ago. That's the address the court sent the legal notice to. That's why I never got it. That's why the first time I heard the word co-debtor was from a bank collector after your discharge went through. Because once the court said you didn't owe this money anymore, the bank needed someone who still did. And that was me. We were going to make it right, my father said quietly, the first thing he'd said since I'd walked in. When, Dad? I asked, and I kept my voice level, the way I would in a room with a family getting bad news, because I'd promised myself I wouldn't raise it, not once. Before or after I paid $152,000 I never agreed to owe. Brett set his beard down harder than he meant to. This isn't fair, he said. You're acting like I asked for any of this. You didn't have to ask, I said, and I slid the last document across the table. The bank's disbursement record. The transfer highlighted in yellow. $87,000 moved from Dad's dealership account into the Junction's account 9 days after the loan funded. 10 days before you reopened with a new patio and a full menu. I did the math, Brett. So did the calendar. The kitchen went completely silent except for the tick of the clock above the stove, the same clock that had hung there my entire childhood. None of that was disclosed in the bankruptcy, I said quietly to my father now, because I could see he already knew it. Transfers to family in the year before filing have to be listed. I checked. It isn't there. Just $11,000 to Aunt Diane's sister for a personal loan. Nothing about Brett. Nothing about $87,000. That's not your business, my mother said. But there was no strength left behind it. Just the shape of the sentence. The way a scarecrow keeps a shape long after the wind's gone out of it. It became my business, I said, the moment my name went on the loan. I didn't come here to ruin anyone's Sunday. I came here because I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from someone else. My attorney has already reported the forged signature to the bank's fraud department and filed a police report. He's also sent a letter to the bankruptcy trustee about the undisclosed transfer. I'm not telling you this to threaten you. I'm telling you because I've spent my whole life being the last one in this family to find things out. And I decided a few weeks ago that was over. Aunt Ellen finally spoke, her voice small in that big, quiet kitchen. Diane, she said, is any of this true? My mother didn't answer her. She looked at me instead, and for just a second, under all the wounded performance, I saw something that might have been fear, the first real thing I'd seen on her face all night. I picked up the folder, closed it, and stood up. I love you both, I said, to my parents, and I meant it, the way you can mean a true thing and still walk away from it. But I'm not paying for a debt I didn't sign, and I'm not staying quiet so this family's dinner stays comfortable. It stopped being comfortable 14 months ago. You just didn't tell me that part. I said goodbye to Aunt Ellen and to Jody, who looked like she wanted to say something and didn't know what. I walked out through the same kitchen door I'd walked through 1,000 times as a girl, and I got in my car, and I didn't cry until I was 3 streets away. And then I let myself, because some things deserve exactly one good cry and no more. The weeks after moved the way consequences do when they've been triggered by paperwork instead of anger. Slower than a scene in a kitchen, but far harder to undo. Heritage Union Bank's fraud department opened a formal investigation after Paul submitted my police report and the identity theft affidavit. It took 11 weeks, which felt like 11 years. But the outcome was clean. Their investigator, a woman named Carla Reyes, confirmed what the notary's empty journal line had already told us, that there was no evidence I'd been present for the signing, and her own document examiner flagged the same handwriting inconsistencies I'd have flagged on a claim file at my own desk. As part of the investigation, Carla's team interviewed Phyllis Dunmore directly, and what came back from that interview was its own quiet gut punch. Phyllis told the investigator that my mother had assured her I said it was fine and just couldn't get away from work that day, and that she'd notarized it on my mother's word because they'd known each other from church for 20 years and she'd never had a reason to doubt her. It wasn't malice from Phyllis. It was trust, misused by someone who understood exactly how to spend it. The bank removed me from the loan entirely and wiped the trade line from all 3 of my credit reports. Carla also told me, near the end of our last call, that they were filing a claim against Phyllis's notary bond. The insurance policy every notary is required to carry precisely for situations like this one, and that her commission to notarize documents in our state would very likely not survive the year. The bank, no longer able to collect from me and unable to reach my father through the discharge, moved to collect the remaining balance the only way left open to it, against the collateral, because the loan was secured by the house on Larkspur Lane, and because Heritage Union's own investigation had by then also flagged the undisclosed transfer to Brett as a possible fraudulent conveyance. My parents were left negotiating a forced sale or a steep refinance on a house they'd owned outright for a decade, just to keep the bank from foreclosing on it. Paul's letter to the bankruptcy trustee, a woman named Marion Kessler, led to exactly what he'd predicted. The trustee reopened the inquiry into the statement of financial affairs, and my father, under oath at a supplemental hearing I did not attend but heard about afterward from Paul, was made to explain the $87,000 that had never appeared on his original schedules. The trustee's office treated it as what it was, an undisclosed transfer to an insider within the look-back period, and pursued a claim to recover it from the junction directly, which meant Brett's restaurant, barely 18 months back on its feet, was suddenly staring down a demand to repay money he'd been told, by our own parents, was simply a gift. The dealership felt it too. The way these things always ripple further than anyone plans for in a town small enough to keep score. A local paper ran 2 paragraphs about the notary bond claim, the kind of story that never says much but says enough. And within a month 2 of my father's longtime customers, men who'd financed cars through his personal guarantee program for years on a handshake, quietly moved their business down the road. Goodwill, I've learned, doesn't come back on credit. My father had spent 31 years building it, and it took one winter to start spending it back down. My father called me on a Thursday evening in June, on the landline, which is how I knew before I even answered that it was really him, and not my mother dialing on his behalf. His voice was slower than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with his heart. I knew about the folder, he said, no greeting. Just the confession he'd apparently been carrying around for weeks. Your mother found it going through my desk after the second time the dealership almost closed. I told her not to use it. I want you to believe that. And then I let her use it anyway. Because I didn't have another way to save this place. And some part of me thought you'd forgive it faster than you'd forgive watching the lot get sold at auction. I was wrong about that. I've been wrong about a lot where you're concerned, Renee. I just never said it out loud until there was nothing left to lose by saying it. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment before I answered. Why didn't you just ask me, Dad? I said. If you'd needed help, and you'd asked me honestly, I don't know what I would have said, but you'd have known the answer was really mine to give. Because I was afraid you'd say no, he said. And I think some part of me already knew I didn't deserve a yes. It wasn't a clean apology. It didn't undo the notary's empty journal line or the address on Winslow Street. For the 14 months, I'd carried a debt I never agreed to. But it was the first true thing he'd said to me since the day Angela called my desk phone. And I let myself hear it as exactly that, one true thing, not a repair, just the beginning of one. My mother never called with anything like it. When we spoke, months later, it was brief and careful. The way 2 people speak when one of them has decided the safest position is to have been misunderstood all along. She still describes what happened, to anyone who'll listen, as a family disagreement over money. I've stopped correcting her. Some people can't afford the mirror, and I've made my peace with not being the one who forces them to look. Brett and I didn't speak for almost 4 months. When he finally called, it wasn't to apologize for the restaurant or the loan directly, because I don't think he fully understood yet what our parents had actually done versus what he'd simply benefited from without asking too many questions. He called to ask, quietly, whether it was true that I'd covered the dealership's insurance and paperwork myself during Dad's recovery years earlier, a detail he'd apparently just learned from Aunt Ellen at a barbecue. I told him it was true. He was quiet for a while. I always thought you just had it easier, he said. Good job, good credit, no drama. I never thought about what that actually cost you to build. It cost me a lot of nights nobody saw, I said. That's the part that never made it into the family story. We're not close, my brother and I. I don't know if we ever will be. But he sends the junction's numbers to his own accountant now instead of to our parents. And he's 3 payments into a real repayment plan with the trustee's office instead of a rescue nobody wrote down. And when I saw him at Thanksgiving, he asked me actual questions about my life instead of assuming there was nothing new to ask about. It isn't everything. It's more than I had before. My credit is clean again. Heritage Union Bank sent written confirmation, the kind with a case number and a signature. that I hold no liability on the account, and I keep that letter in the same kind of plain folder I've kept everything else in, filed under a label that just says done. Marcus and I bought a small house last spring, our first, with a mortgage that has exactly two names on it, both of them mine to give. My company promoted me that same spring, not because of anything to do with my family, but because 11 years of finding the places where a story doesn't match the paperwork turns out to be a skill people notice eventually, even when it took my own family that long to see it. I still talk to my mother sometimes. Holidays, mostly, brief and polite, the way you talk to someone you used to know well. My father comes by the new house on his own now, without her, once every few weeks, and he sits at our kitchen table while Marcus makes coffee, and he doesn't bring up the loan, and neither do I, because some conversations only need to happen once to mean something. People ask me sometimes if I regret making it so public, standing in that kitchen with a folder instead of handling it quietly the way I'd handled everything else in that family for 36 years. I don't. I spent my whole life being the one who fixed things without being asked and without being thanked. And I told myself that was love, the doing kind, the kind that doesn't need to be said out loud. What I learned, standing in that kitchen with my name on paperwork I'd never seen, is that being useful was never the same thing as being respected. And a family that only remembers you when they need your credit score was never really keeping score of you at all. I didn't need my name taken off a piece of paper to know what I was worth. But I'll admit, it helped to see it in writing. If your family has ever used your name, your credit, or your good nature without asking, and called it love because asking might have gotten a no, I want you to hear this. A signature is yours to give. Nobody else's hand gets to hold the pen for you, no matter what they call the reason. Tell me in the comments if you've ever found your own name somewhere you never agreed to be. Share this with the one who's always been the reliable one in your family, the one who reads the fine print so nobody else has to. And subscribe to the Quiet Ledger, where the ones who kept the books always get the last page.